Good morning and welcome to the Morning Report. My name is Willie Lawson. When Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer went on MS Now, which used to be MSNBC, this week to rail against the Safeguard American Voter Eligibility Act, better known as the SAVE Act, he dropped a political grenade that's now shaking up the debate over voter ID, citizenship verification, the election integrity in Washington. Schumer didn't just oppose the bill, he said it was Jim Crow 2.0. That characterization had instantly lit up both sides of the political aisle. His critics call it an obvious overreach. Others call it political theater, and the polling around the issue only adds fuel to the fire. So here's what's happening, and here's why it matters. Now, at the most basic level, the SAVE Act would amend federal voter registration law to require documentary proof of US citizenship at the time someone registers to vote in federal elections. Now, this is different than most current voter ID laws because it doesn't just ask for ID at the ballot box like we do here in Florida. It requires proof of citizenship before someone can even be eligible to register. So it catches them hopefully at the very beginning of the process. So under this bill, states would be prohibited from processing a federal voter registration unless the applicant presents acceptable proof of citizenship, such as a passport or birth certificate. States must devise alternative paths for someone to provide evidence of citizenship if they cannot present these documents on the spot. So non-citizens identified through this process would be removed from the voter rolls. So if you couldn't, you'd be out, right? There would be criminal penalties for limited circumstances for knowingly registering non-citizens. Now, how this is important is that an organization that I'm a member of, founding member of, is Urban Game Changers, and we have the ability to register voters here in the state of Florida. Now, what I have to do from now on is make sure that if it's a federal election, that I have proof that someone is a U.S. citizen. They have a passport, they have their naturalization papers, whatever, before we can register them to vote. There you go. So, in short, the SAVE Act is a mean to codify citizenship verification as part of voter registration. See, now that doesn't sound outrageous to you, does it? No, of course not. Proponents call it a vital safeguard to ensure only lawful citizens vote. Opponents say the rules will create needless bureaucratic barriers to voting. Not if you're a U.S. citizen, it doesn't. Can I see your license? Yeah. All right. There you go. Not if you're a U.S. citizen, it doesn't create any barrier at all because most U.S. citizens will have some sort of ID, military ID. They'll have a driver's license, a, um, a state ID. They'll have something. Most citizens will, especially if they're going to get to the point where they're actually going to vote. They'll have something. So it only creates a barrier for the illegal, which is the point. Okay. So there you go. It's going to create a barrier, especially for the eligible, but not the poor, the document poor Americans. There. Now, who are they talking about? Who are the document poor or the doc poor Americans? We'll get to that. And that's where Schumer stepped in. In his interview, he didn't just oppose the SAVE Act, he described it as vicious and nasty and equated it to Jim Crow era voter suppression. He said it would discriminate or disenfranchise millions of citizens and seize control of our elections. Jeez. Schumer's rhetoric has two key components. First of all, the moral framing. So to him, the bill is not just bad policy, it's a rollback of civil rights. Number two, political messaging. Calling it Jim Crow 2.0 instantly reframes the issue from a technical dispute about voter verification to a moral battle over racial equity, equality, and historical comparison. Now, it's worth noting that this is not the first time Schumer or other Democrats have used this line. Similar warnings were issued in 2021 when Georgia enacted its own voter ID citizenship verification laws, warning that critics say did not materialize as predicted when Black voters turnout actually increased in subsequent elections. That's the political sting opponents of Schumer like to drive home. If Georgia laws didn't suppress turnout, then why should the SAVE Act be labeled as Jim Crow? Now, here's where the dynamic becomes politically dicey, but deeply interesting. In the town hall piece written by Jeff Charles, a friend of mine, that triggered all this analysis, the interviewer cited polling that shows that 95% of Republicans and 71% of Democrats. Wait a minute. 95% of Republicans and 71% of Democrats support voter ID and citizenship verification. Schumer dismissed that as irrelevant to the substance of the bill, sticking with his moral framing. So, 71%, nearly 3/4 of Democrats polled said, oh, no, voter ID and citizen verification is a good idea. Now, Chuck Schumer, the Democrat, says, screw them. Who cares? So if it's true, that's a startling statistic. It would mean a clear majority of Democrats own base support essentially the key principle underlying the SAVE Act. Now, whether that exact figure reflects the broader electorate views generally depends on the specific, the questions of polls and the science of polling. But national polling, including by CNN and other mainstream outlets, consistently show broad bipartisan support for voter ID, often with particularly strong numbers among Black and Latino voters. That complicates the narrative that such requirements are opposed primarily by minorities. They're not. And it helps explain why Republicans see political space to push this legislation. So whether Democrats, alter their messaging in response to these figures, is a political calculus that is still unfolding. Now, supporters of the SAVE Act, primarily Republicans and election integrity groups, argue that this bill is common sense reform that ensures that only U.S. citizens vote in federal elections. They frame this as a fundamental to election legitimacy. Okay, here's some key arguments. Citizenship is already a legal requirement to vote. First of all, it's not like illegals were okay to vote before and now they're not. Citizenship is already a legal requirement to vote. Republican supporters should be pointing out that non-citizens are already prohibited from voting in federal elections. And this bill simply enforces that rule with clear documentation standards. That's it. Safeguards trust in elections. By tightening the registration rules, supporters say that we can reduce public skepticism about voter rolls and tamper-proof elections, something they argue is critical after years of post-election disputes. It's interesting. Before I go on, it was interesting that after the election in 2020, that people were getting their YouTube accounts and their Twitter accounts and their Facebook accounts banned. They're being canceled for even suggesting that there may be some problems with the election. even suggesting that there might be, questioning, right? People lost millions of dollars and lost their careers, right? But I'll tell you what, I was on a radio interview with a candidate who had run for governor of the state of Florida and lost. Thank goodness he lost. And we were talking about um, the gubernatorial election that happened in Georgia, and he was sure. He said everybody knows that there was voter fraud in that election fraud in that election. And I'm saying I didn't hear about any widespread voter fraud. So he instantly said that there's voter fraud. So let me get this right. If Democrats, and this happened just recently in 2024 as well. Well, if Democrats say there's voter fraud, then that's cool. That's looking for election integrity, and that's shoring up the public's trust in these elections. But if conservatives say, hey, listen, why don't we just take one of the things that are already illegal and we solidify that more, we codify that, that's somehow Jim Crow. That's beyond pay. Now, here's the deal. There is broad public support. As noted, public opinion tends to strongly favor voter ID and citizenship requirements, even among groups that are typically skeptical of adding or additional voter restrictions. So, in describing the GOP strategy, Senate Republicans like Senator Rick Scott of the state of Florida have even pledged to force Democrats into taking filibusters to make a public spectacle of their opposition, reinforcing how central this issue has become to the larger political agenda. So Rick Scott is like, okay, filibuster, defend that point. Defend the point that you don't want voter ID at elections. Go ahead and try to defend that. Defend that you think it's okay for illegals to vote in federal elections. Go ahead, try to defend that. So from this standpoint, the SAVE Act is portrayed not as a burden, but as a necessary correction that aligns law with reality and public expectations. But opponents, including major civil rights groups, some election officials, and Democrat politicians, see the SAVE Act very differently. Their claims focus on practical barriers and potential disenfranchisement rather than moral labels. Critics often make these points. Millions of legal citizens lack easy access to proof of citizenship.
It suppresses the African American vote?
Definitely.
Tell us how.
Because they're less likely to have state IDs.
Minority voters are less likely to have the kinds of IDs that have been described or required.
These type of people don't live in areas with easy access to DMVs or other places where they can get identification.
You can always get IDs you do over the internet. Does that also make it difficult for black people in particular?
Yeah, you have to have access to the internet. You have to be able to pay an internet service provider for certain fees.
Do you think that's...
Research from nonpartisan institutions show that tens of millions of Americans don't have their birth certificates. But I tell you what, you can get one. You do. You can. How do I know? Because I got one. That's how I know. And I don't think I ever had in my possession. I think my mom had it at some point, but I don't think my mother died when I was 23 years old, and I'm 65 here. I'll be 66 this year. But there was a long time that I went through life without my birth certificate. I didn't have it, but I know I was born, and I got online, and I found out what I had to do, and I got it. In order to get the star on your license, a real ID, I needed a birth certificate, so I got mine. I have mine now. So don't tell me that you can't get it if you don't have it, because you can. unless you were born in the 1800s before they had birth certificates. And if you were born in the country, at home, and somehow didn't get a birth certificate, there are church records, and there are fewer and fewer and fewer, not millions of people. There are not tens of millions of people who can't get their birth certificate. A lot of us don't have passports, and they may not be readily available. But you know what you can do? You can get it. And there are 2 years between every federal election. Plenty of time. You can do it. If that's the case with you. I don't believe that there's tens of millions of people, although they say there are. It says because the SAVE Act envisions face-to-face verification, it could dismantle or severely complicate popular accessible voter registration systems in many states. Voter registration should be face-to-face. It should be like when Urban Game Changers has a voter registration event. There's a face, this one, and another face, that one there. May I see that? Thank you. Why? Because it's that important. They also say that disparate impact on vulnerable groups. How about vulnerable groups? Groups like the elderly, like low-income citizens. Like, I love that, because you're a low-income citizen, somehow you can't figure this out. And I'm going to tell you, that's all dog whistle for Black. It is. If I remember, I'm going to put some clips in here from a video that I did a couple of days ago. I'm telling you, that's what they mean. Rural citizens, rural voters, because rural people are stupid. And even women, especially those who change names due to marriage. Funny story. When it was time to get, I think it was time to get Real ID for my wife, and they were going to use her social security card or whatever, and they found out that that name on her social security card was her maiden name, wasn't her married name. But we had to get a social security card with her name on it, her married name that we've been using 20 plus years at that point. So she had a birth certificate. We went to the Social Security Administration office, which is one of the most depressing places I've ever been. I know why people crash out there. It's terrible. But we had her birth certificate and whatever other documents we had, and the person behind the glass, because they were behind the glass, because Social Security Administration, people crash out there. We got it done. In about 10 days, it came in the mail. Fine. So I understand that happens. Now, it didn't have to happen to us. We just didn't know any better. And now people do. We just didn't know any better. And nobody ever asked. It's like, I laugh because I likened it that no one's ever asked for my high school diploma either. You? Anybody ever ask you for your high school diploma? They just assume you graduated from high school, right? If you say you did, right? Anybody ever ask you for the diploma? Could you get a hold of one? But I bet you could get a hold of your legal transcripts from high school if you needed to, right? You know what high school you went to. You know what district it was in. You could probably get a hold of that if you had to. If you had 2 years to do it, you could probably make that work. And now with the SAVE Act, if you know that that's going to be a situation, then you handle it like an adult. Why? Because it's important enough to do that. right? There you go. So from this perspective, the bill may not be racist per se, but its effects could still disadvantage certain communities, which they say it, but I think that's entirely BS. Because now, as soon as you know, then you rectify that. All done. Life is good, and it's important to do. It's important to do. And this again goes back to registration. There isn't anything in the bill that says they're going to make everybody who's already on the voter rolls prove they're an American citizen. This is what they're trying to get you to believe. That's not in the bill. This prevents new registrants from getting through. If you're already through, you're through. You're already on the voting side, you're on the voting side. If you're a non-citizen, then there may be some, but if you're a citizen, you're already through. No one's going to go knocking on your door. Show us your papers so you can vote. That's not going to happen. They're going to try to make you believe that, though. People on the left are going to push that argument, and that's simply not the case. Now, there is also a layered legal debate about whether federal law should preempt state voter registration procedures to this extent. But under the current legal framework, the National Voter Registration Act sets federal minimum standards for voter registration. But the states retain broad authority to implement and administer elections. Opponents of the SAVE Act argue that forcing uniform documentation could undermine states' ability to tailor their systems to local needs and technology, which is nonsense. Election administrators also warn that any overhaul of voter registration processes, especially ones that eliminate online and mail options, could create logistical headaches and balloon costs without significant evidence of widespread non-citizen fraud. It doesn't have anything to do with non-citizen fraud. It has to do with that non-citizens can't vote anyway. So making laws that keeps them from voting shouldn't be a big problem, should it? Huh? But it is. Because you know why, right? This is not and Trump's been out there saying that in some places the federal government, because he's out there being Trump. Mr. President, stop. This is not a federal takeover of state elections or local elections. This is not. This is a stopgap measure to keep illegal aliens, and I'll say it that way, illegal aliens from voting in federal elections. All right. Now, Schumer's use of Jim Crow is not just moral rhetoric. It's strategic political messaging. So by framing the debate this way, Democrats are trying to put Republicans on the defensive and hope to energize their base around voting rights ahead of key midterm elections. Some Democrats even argue that they would rather shut down the government than allow the SAVE Act to attach to must-pass spending bills. This is, frankly, a lifeline for the Democrats. They had nothing, and they still have zero to run on. Nothing. Because the "we hate Trump and you ought to hate Trump too" message is wearing a little thin. It's wearing a little thin. They have zero. For a while, it was, before it was Russia, right? And, it was all that stuff, and then it ended up being Epstein, until we found out that nobody cares about Russia, and nobody cares about Epstein. So they got nothing. They got bumpkus. So this was kind of a lifeline. And in true Democrat fashion, Chuck Schumer picked it up. This is something that we can campaign against. This is Jim Crow, right? So Republicans, for their part, see this as an opportunity to force Democrats to explain why they expose documentation requirements that a majority of voters, including many Democrats, say that they support. They're banking on public opinion and election integrity messaging to flip the script. But in a polarized environment where confidence in elections is already low amongst large portions of the electorate, this fight is about more than a single bill. It's a proxy for a larger question. What does fair election policy look like? And who gets to decide? And how do we balance access with accountability? All right, let's finish up. The SAVE Act is a lightning rod because it sits at the intersection of election integrity, voter access, federal/state power, racial politics. Schumer's Jim Crow 2.0 characterization reflects real fears about disenfranchisement, fears that some voters and advocates trace back to historic suppression tactics. But the political and the policy reality is also that millions of Americans, including minority communities, support voter ID and citizenship verification in some form. So whether the SAVE Act becomes law will depend not just on policy merits, but on the strategy, messaging, and broader political landscape. So for conservatives and Morning Report audiences committed to securing elections and ensuring that only citizens vote in federal elections, this battle is one to watch very carefully and to shape with facts, data, and consistent argumentation. Call your Congress critter. Let them know. If you want the SAVE Act to pass, tell them. And if your Congress critter is seemingly against the SAVE Act, you better ask them why. You better ask them why. And you better ask them that, or let them know that you disagree with them. Because, national polls, they can just go, huh. But a constant barrage, if nothing else, of texts and phone calls and emails to their offices, both in Washington and in district, that's a kind of polling that they can't dismiss. All right, we got to get out of here and make room for somebody else. So until we see you again, go out there and learn something, love somebody, and for goodness sakes, y'all take care of yourself. We will see you when we